Welcome to Only Seniors. I'm Tom Callahan, your host. Everybody ages every day. Who knew? It's one of the things we all share regardless of our race, creed, religious affiliation, or even sexual or gender identity. Some of us prepare for it better than others, while at the same time, some people try to avoid it as best they can. Most people try to avoid it because they don't have a plan, because they don't think they have any options open to them. Unfortunately, some people don't have a lot of options open to them when they age. Today, we're going to be talking about the lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender community and the issues facing them in the aging process. Yes, folks, even the fabulous people get old. My guest today is Joy Silver, LGBT aging specialist and developer of Rainbow Vision Senior Living. Joy, welcome to Only Seniors.
Thank you, Tom.
Joy, what are some of the biggest issues facing the LGBT community when it comes to aging and retiring?
Well, I think one of the things, and thank you for inviting me here to talk about this. You know, it is my favorite subject.
I know.
Yeah. One of the main things that I think we should look at is the difference between what is a community and what is a population. And I think right there, we need to round up and look at what the LGBT community actually is. The LGBT community is made up of all different economic classes, races, ethnicities, values, and political parties. As hard as that may be to believe, we're not just one big happy family. And so from that point, the differences of challenges of part of our population versus others is really going to be stratified by those particular definitions. I think that it's very important to realize that the baby boomer population itself is faced with challenges of aging, and we're going to need to meet that head on. One of the greatest challenges for our particular population will be finding a realistic definition for the concept of old. In general, we don't have familiar decision influencers, usually known as the oldest daughter caretaker in the mainstream. We need to have a plan in place to face the obstacle known in the industry as I'm never getting old and I'm not ready for that yet. So I would say those are some of the basic things we're going to be facing as a population.
Okay. What form of discrimination is the community facing? I mean, I don't think a lot of caregivers are set up to care for the LGBT community.
This is particularly true because in urban areas, many of the people who are caretakers, and even in some of the smaller town areas, they are from particularly conservative religious countries and can be of an immigrant population. And so you're right, there are some of the discriminations and unfamiliarity of handling an LGBT population. The biggest issue for our age group is that many of our population, they don't have children. Mm-hmm. And so therein, the discrimination becomes no advocates. We have issues of our older population might not have had the opportunity to be married. They don't have the financial protections of marriage when it comes to paperwork in place or a plan in place. And the caretakers themselves may not be familiar with our population and might find it difficult to absorb and to handle and to integrate into their caregiving.
Okay. Now, what form does that discrimination take?
It can take many forms. A lot of economic challenges with that, but also unfamiliarity with some of what happens when people age and what they may present with and how to recognize it and how to also create an environment that helps the senior population become comfortable with aging in a sense of what they relate to, especially from a long-term memory point of view. They may not want to handle issues of people with AIDS. They may not want to handle issues that they see solely as a gay disease, and that may be frightening for them to handle. And also for the transgender community, which is a whole nother set of possible discriminations or feelings about handling those particular medical issues.
Now, what happens with that? do caregivers actually refuse to take care of people who either have AIDS or who are transgendered or just for the fact that they're gay or lesbian?
It can happen. It can happen.
Okay. What can be done to ensure that this doesn't happen?
Right now, there's a pretty big, there's a strong movement towards diversity and cultural competency training, especially in areas that have large LGBT populations. This may not reach out to the more conservative or more religiously affiliated communities, particularly in smaller rural areas or smaller towns.
Wow. Okay. What economic issues does the LGBT community face?
Facing many of the issues that have to do with no protection. First of all, we have the lesbian group who are, so you have essentially you have women who made less money than men anyway.
Okay.
And so if you have two women in a relationship, they may be less prepared for aging because they didn't have the same earning power that men have had in their lives. But more than that, if there was any discrimination that people faced in their career lives, that will have had effect on them on a financial level, and they won't be adequately prepared. In fact, we should take a step further and say that is a baby boomer issue in general. Baby boomers did not necessarily prepare for aging.
I think a lot of people want to avoid aging if possible.
And I think that that's an important thing that you're saying, Tom, because what is old? When am I old?
True.
What are the presenting events that let me know that I'm going to need help? One of the things that often happens with groups of people when I speak to them, their concept, whether they are straight, mainstream, or LGBTQIA, they have an idea of aging is going to be two things. One, I'm going to be as I am at 40 years old, except I'm going to have silver hair or gray hair. Or two, they feel that I'm never going to get old. And when I do, I'm going to live with all my friends and we're going to help each other when we have issues and problems. The one thing they fail to realize is we're all the same age.
True.
Most of our peers are the same age. And by the way, you don't get over aging. You know, it's not sitting with somebody with chicken soup for 2 weeks till they're over aging. It's aggressive. And this is a notion that people have in their heads when they think about community. Tom, it's an ideal state. Going a little further into community versus population. Mm-hmm. Here you've had a set of people who've never lived really in community, in a communal setting necessarily. Okay. They don't really have the skills for living in a setting that is actual community, where your next door neighbors are people you know to the degree where you're eating with them and they're spending the kind of time you might in a naturally occurring retirement community or an established retirement community or senior living, or even in affordable housing. Or if you've ever belonged to a condo board, they can be extremely difficult to get through in a self-governing kind of a way. So we're not prepared for this kind of life. But somehow, when we get old, we're going to be.
True.
Magically, someday we're going to go over that rainbow and everyone's going to live happily ever after because we're all of a similar mind. But we're not all of a similar mind. And this is the big fallacy or fantastic thinking that many people have going into the aging process, that someday when they finally get old, they're going to have these great community skills. More than likely, the things that were wrong when we were young get worse when we're older sometimes. We have less tolerance and less patience because we have more personal issues and more physical issues and often more mental or medical issues.
True. And on top of that, people are so entrenched in the way that they're currently doing something, for them to try to adapt to a community living just isn't going to happen. And as you're saying, it isn't magically going to happen.
Right.
They're too entrenched. And you're right, a lot of people have that ideal of magic is suddenly going to happen when I'm 82. Or when they're 82, it's going to happen when I'm 90. Or it's always going to be down the road. Now, you've touched on some of the social issues that people are going to be facing when they're living in community. What are some of the housing options that are available for the LGBT community?
Right now, there's a big push towards affordable housing, both in the LGBT populations, but also for seniors in general. Affordable housing seems to be the key word right now. But what is affordable housing, and affordable to whom, is something that we're still going to have to see defined. Some of the major cities, New York is looking at doing some affordable housing. Other cities like Chicago have some units of affordable housing. San Francisco is still trying to do their projects for affordable housing now. It's become the catch-all word. But basically speaking, I think that cities are going to have to look at how they're handling baby boomers in general, since the largest population of old people that we'll have ever seen in history before, and how they're going to handle all of the different kinds of people who need affordable housing, of which LGBT people will be a part of that.
True. Is there enough affordable housing now for seniors, do you think?
I don't think there can ever be enough affordable housing.
That's true. Okay.
Yeah.
And now you were mentioning that, we're looking at major cities, like you said, New York, Chicago, San Francisco. What happens in the rural areas? What's going on there?
Well, I'm not an authority on rural areas, but I do speak to people in parts of Texas and parts of New Mexico. And the stratification of gay people, it's a totally a different life. And what happens in those areas, it all depends on the values of wherever people are. And so I think there are less options just because we're less in numbers in those places.
Okay. Now, have there been any communities that have been developed, I don't want to say strictly for the LGBT community, but with a mind to the LGBT community?
I know right now, and I think one of the things to think about, there is the Stonewall Development Group in Palm Springs. And they're looking at a certain number of units, particularly for assisted living. And so they're moving forward with doing that particular project. There have been projects. There's a project up in Santa Rosa, and there's also a project in Los Angeles, which was for low-cost housing. It's below affordable housing. Some projects there.
Now, is it fashionable, or I'm not really sure what the word is I'm looking for, but is it? I've been hearing a lot of things floating around within the development fields, and everybody always says, oh, they should build a community for the LGBT people. And I keep telling people, well, you really can't do that because that's considered redlining or discrimination. What is going on in that field? I mean, is this something that the LGBT community is looking for?
Well, for example, also in the Palm Springs area, there's a lesbian project that Olivia Cruise Ships is putting together. More of an active adult kind of community. Can you build strictly for LGBT people? No, that would be against the law. Can you market it towards LGBT population? Yes. Can you market it precisely so that would be the majority of people who know about it? Yes, you can do that. But you could you couldn't restrict it to simply LGBT people. But Tom, we should look at that a little deeper, because we're always using all of those letters, LGBT, as if there's some paint that makes all of those people get along together. And there isn't. L may not get along with G, who may not get along with B, who may not even know what a T is. All of these things are not one and the same, even though they're painted with one rainbow brush. And so in the community in Rainbow Vision, those kinds of things had to be really thought out. I would say that the trans people are just coming into their own. Many of the older LG people didn't really have a good concept of what that really was about, because we're not just talking orientation. In that case, we're talking about gender. And there are trans people who are coming out later in life, and so they're undergoing a whole nother life in the life they're having now, and are dealing and handling things of that nature. So there's a lot to do and a lot to go with that.
So it truly is. I mean, not only are they handling the issues of aging, but they're handling huge life transitions.
Exactly. So becoming the aging, I remember I sat on a panel at the American Society on Aging, and a woman was presenting with us on that panel, and she was in her close to 80, and she had just become a woman in the past 5 years or so at that point. And she was married to her wife, who had dementia and didn't really realize that her husband was now her wife. But they would not allow the transgender woman to take that role on in the community that the woman who had Alzheimer was living in. I mean, it's so confusing. But it's, in a sense, this woman was my hero, because with all that she went through, she still, at the first moment where she could afford to transition, where she felt confident enough, where she fulfilled whatever duties she felt she had towards her wife who had Alzheimer, she went ahead and she started to live for herself.
Amazing.
It is an amazing story.
It is an amazing story. It's so, and as you were saying, the community that she was living in was not letting her take responsibility for her wife. And I guess that goes back to some of the discrimination that is faced within the larger, all the initials community, the LGBTI and everything. They just, people don't realize that the people who are trying to care for them are discriminating against them by not accepting them as who they are.
Well, and what's important also, and this is, again, I go back to my paintbrush of the alphabet letters. Being LGBT or being L and G, is that enough to make a population a community? There has to be something that unifies people beside their orientation, or they're going to have a hard time living together. Mm-hmm. An example for that is, and I think it's one of the issues around senior living that can make it successful or not successful. If people are living together because they're compromised and they need care, then that's why they're living in a community. They understand that there's a compassion between, not necessarily, but can have a compassion between the residents that live there, because they understand that they are kind of all in the same boat and they're going to make the best life they can for themselves. But LGBT people who are active and are not yet physically or mentally compromised, if they don't have other values besides that orientation, what will keep them together? And it's not a golf community where they're all going to participate in golf or an activity, or it's not necessarily a church or a faith or so what are the values? I think what's more important than simply orientation, and I think orientation is important, but what are the values of that population? One of the things that we're talking to with the project in Palm Springs with our friend Richard, for example, he's putting together something he's got a group together. And when he came to speak to me about what's the most important thing necessary to put together an LGBT senior living community that would have services, I said, don't worry about the bricks and mortar. Get the group socialized so that you're doing things and planning things. In other words, you're a community without walls already. Mm-hmm. That's the group that will get along when they have the bricks and mortar around them.
So it's building the community before you actually build the community.
Absolutely, because houses and residences do not a community make. But people think that.
That's true.
I'll put some homes around each other and there's a community and we're going to go move in. Well, yes, you may do that, but there's no guarantee that this is going to be the heaven the Oz that you're hoping that you're getting to. Yeah. But if there's already shared interests, you have a better chance of creating something that's going to work.
Now, what are some of the services that the community can turn to? Are there community? Where can people of the LGBT community find services that would be willing to help them with what they're looking to do or what their needs are?
This is a large question because it's different in each regional area. Um, there are advocates, there are LGBT centers, there are LGBT aging centers. There are also churches, synagogues, and temples, and other spiritual groups. There are outing, social groups. But in larger cities, social services usually have LGBT advocates in those social services now. There's a lot of social services, for example, in New York City. I don't think the opportunities are as high as they are in New York and in San Francisco in smaller towns. So again, it's a numbers game, as it were. You have SAGE, you have GRIO Circle for people of color, you have lesbian groups, women's groups that can advocate for aging issues.
So there are people out there that can help, and I like the fact that you said that people can turn to community centers, LGBT aging centers, and even their churches or synagogues, because sometimes there's that misconception that just because it's a religious house, that they're automatically going to be discriminating. But what I've been finding out there is there's actually some churches that are very welcoming to the community and that are looking to make a difference.
I think a lot of religious groups that are not fundamentalist, and I do want to make it, I want to separate the fundamentalism from religious organizations and spiritual groups, have a lot of LGBT leadership in those groups because they're reinvigorating the spiritual practices of many of those faiths.
True. Who can someone contact about integrating these services into their community? If I was living in central New Jersey and I didn't know who to reach out to, who would you say would be a good catch-all for them to start?
Well, I would say Tom Callahan would probably be the right person to speak to about that in central Jersey.
Okay, I'm in central New York State. Who should I reach out to?
Yeah, right. Oh, let's see. I don't know. You can always contact SAGE if you want services, or GRIO if you want services in those areas.
Okay.
I mean, the New York State Aging Services actually is very good for that. And they have a lot of programs that are LGBT oriented in the state of New York, which is a great thing.
Okay. Now, you've mentioned two organizations here. You've mentioned SAGE and GRIO Circle.
Yeah.
Could you expand on what these organizations are? Because not all of our viewers are going to know.
Okay. Well, SAGE is the oldest organization that's been doing senior services since for over 30 years. And so they're the strongest. And they also have across the country, they have affiliated SAGE centers that are usually connected to the gay centers and LGBT centers across the country in smaller towns. And what that means is they'll have programs, and they'll have case managers, and they'll also be running their own centers. And so there are activities, and there are home visits, and there are meal programs and that sort of thing that happen through SAGE. GRIO Circle is a similar organization, but identifying the culture and the values for people of color. And so they'll do that sort of thing with a buddy-to-buddy program, where they'll call people in their homes and they'll visit, and they also have programs and holiday events and social events. And they also have case manager for issues for LGBT people of color.
Okay. Now, I know you're a part of GRIO Circle, and you recently worked on a project for them. Could you expand on that one for us? The video.
Yes. Oh, yes. How could I forget Silver Rainbow? Speaking of which, what we did recently, and this is kind of a breakthrough, I think, in a national way. We hear LGBT seniors, and we don't necessarily see people of color included in that. And what GRIO did was put together a documentary film of people of color telling their stories, their history, what the organization has done for them, what programmatic aspects are important, but just telling us the history of who people of color are that are seniors. And it's the voice that needs to be heard in a stronger way. And we're hoping to be sure that people do get to hear that.
Good. And does Griot Circle have a website that this can
Yes,
be viewed at?
griotcircle.org, and you can see a part of our film on there.
Okay, very good. All right, well, we have a few minutes left. I would just like to, start wrapping up with you. What, I guess there's not any one answer to this question, but what would be an ideal setting for an LGBT community?
The ideal setting for an LGBT community would be like I was discussing with you before, something that was tied together by either a shared value or activity in addition to orientation or gender transition. That's a very, very important thing, so that there would be a cohesion of the group that would engender better living circumstance and more engagement with the residents that would be living in any one particular place. I think that's really a critical thing. It's really important to know that the definition of what is old and coming to terms with that is really going to determine what our options are as we age. The longer we want to be in denial about that issue, the harder it will be for options to remain open to us, because we won't see them, because somebody else will be making that decision for us.
Very good. Joy Silver, thank you for joining us here on Only Seniors. Appreciate it. And I think I'm going to have you back at another time, because you've touched on so many things that we need to expand on, and a message that we really need to get out there.
My pleasure, Tom, and thank you.
Thank you. As I said, even fabulous gets old. Everybody ages every day. The idea is to get a plan together. Knowing what is going to be the next step is always a big hurdle for anyone to get over. But it's a hurdle that we have to cross in order to age properly. I'm Tom Callahan. Thank you for joining me here on Only Seniors.